New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring the principles of remote viewing. What is it that distinguishes remote viewing from other forms of extrasensory perception? My guest is Paul Smith. Paul happens to be the guest who was featured on the single most popular video here on the New Thinking Aloud channel on training remote viewing. He is the founder of the Remote Viewing Instructional Services Company. He is one of the longest-serving original instructors from the Army's Stargate program. So he knows remote viewing from virtually its beginning. He is the author of Reading the Enemy's Mind Inside Stargate, America's Psychic Espionage Program. He's also author of The Essential Guide to Remote Viewing, The Secret Military Remote Perception Skill Anyone Can Learn. Paul is based in Cedar City, Utah, and now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Paul. It is a pleasure to be with you once again, and I want to repeat the emphasis for a benefit of viewers who may not know that you are the guest whose interview on training remote viewing is the single most popular interview on the entire New Thinking Aloud channel of well over 1,000 interviews.
Well, I am happy to be of service to you, Jeff.
It's always a pleasure to be with you. And I know right away some of our guests are going to say, well, why is he wearing that belt across his belly and so on? So why don't we get that out of the way?
Yeah, well, back in June, I had a hip replacement. I had to replace my earlier hip replacement. And I thought everything was good. But in the process of recovering from that, my shoulder started to go out on me. And so they had to do a rotator cuff tendon repair, and also the muscle attached to it had some problems itself. Consequence of getting old and jumping out of too many perfectly good airplanes when I was in the Army.
That surgery, I gather, was just a few weeks ago.
It was. In fact, it was a week ago Monday.
I would say you're doing quite well for somebody who has that recently completed shoulder surgery.
I have to say I'm very pleased with how little, at least pain, has resulted from this. I talked to a lot of people about it, and they're all saying, oh, man, that was horrible. I was in agony for weeks and all that. I haven't had that experience, and I haven't even used any of the heavy narcotics that they gave me. So I'm feeling blessed about this.
Yes, you're fortunate. Well, today we're going to be talking about remote viewing principles. And there is a document. It's been published on the 12 principles of remote viewing. You and I are both signatories on this document. Let's talk about the impulse to create such a document. How did it get started? Why was there a felt need?
Yeah, and I think that's a great place to start. First, the organization through which it's been published is called the Center Lane Project, which has borrowed a name from an original iteration of the remote viewing program in the Army. Used to be called Center Lane for a while. It's a nonprofit organization, and its main agenda is to preserve the original version of what we're now calling controlled remote viewing, which was created by the one who created remote viewing in the first place, Ingo Swann, and of course the chief scientist, Hal Puthoff. And they worked together and created controlled remote viewing. But it's been, unfortunately, more and more submerged by all kinds of other approaches to remote viewing that have showed on the scene, and is not well preserved because fewer people are practicing it. So that's the point of the Center Lane program. But in the process of dealing with that, we ran into an issue, and that is that more and more people are joining the remote viewing community who actually don't even really have a clue about remote viewing. They think often that it's synonymous with channeling or out-of-body experience or psychic reading or whatever their particular forte is in the, I guess that's not how you say it, fort in French, but in the psychic world, so to speak. And so they think that those things are isomorphic with remote viewing, and they're not. And so we felt like there needed to be some education presented here, and we put together this list of principles. I have to give credit where credit is due. The impetus to this was one of my German students and now course coordinator, Jana Roca, who lives over in Weimar, Germany. We all recognized the issue, and she decided to do something about it. And so she did the first drafts of this document, and we've been working together on it ever since. When I say we, I'm talking about me, Tom McNair, who was Ingo Swann's best ever student, Bill Ray, who was a commander of the Stargate program for a while, and Jana. We've all been kind of contributing to this document to try and polish it up and make it coherent and hopefully a little accessible to the public.
One of the main points I gather from the document itself is that remote viewing does not refer to a psychic skill. Most people think it does, so that it's equivalent to, let's say, clairvoyance. And you're saying that's not what the definition of remote viewing is about.
No, not exactly. Now, so we have a problem with words here, as we often do in the world. So the word psychic can be used in a number of different ways. And I want to say up front that Ingo Swann, the one who invented remote viewing, so to speak, he really didn't like the word psychic very well. In fact, he kept yelling at me when I'd use it. But, we don't have another word to describe a wide variety of nuances. And so some people, when they say psychic, they have in mind the psychic sitting at a table with a crystal ball or whatever, or someone doing a psychic reading, or even some folks think of the tarot, doing tarot as a psychic skill, psychic thing. And in fact, the term does apply to all those things, used in one certain way. It can also be used synonymously with the term extrasensory perception. A lot of people kind of equate the two as meaning the same thing. Now, extrasensory perception, or ESP, a lot of people misunderstand that. They think of extrasensory perception as meaning that you have an extra sense. That's the psychic sense, so to speak. And that's not what it actually means. Extrasensory is meant in the sense that it's extra, like outside of, like you have extramarital, or you have extraterrestrial, or you have extracurricular, which means outside of those environments. So extracurricular means not in the school itself, but outside of the teaching, right? And so extrasensory means outside of the senses. So you're having a perceptual experience that doesn't involve the intermediacy of the senses. The senses aren't conveying the information. Something else is conveying it to the sensory centers in the brain, and you have a perceptual experience as if the senses were involved, when in fact they are not. They're bypassed.
That's pretty clear. So how does the definition of remote viewing differ from this definition of extrasensory perception?
Okay, so remote it doesn't differ. Well, it does differ. So first off, remote viewing is a form of extrasensory perception. Okay, if you were to draw a Venn diagram, you have a circle, and inside that are different ways of using ESP. Remote viewing would be one of those smaller circles inside of that Venn diagram. That's overall is the domain extrasensory perception. So it's a form of ESP, but it's really a kind of a skill set that you develop within the boundaries of extrasensory perception. And it was the whole idea started with Ingo Swann, but it was really fully developed at SRI International. It used to be the old Stanford Research Institute. And the people involved in it were Russell Targ and Hal Puthoff. And Ingo Swann, of course, was the instigator, ultimately. And there are other really actually quite prominent folks involved in it. And they all work together trying to formulate remote viewing. Okay, so it's a disciplined skill. Now, certain different people have different opinions even back then. So if you talk to, for example, Russell Targ or Stephen Schwartz, they think of it as a very minimal skill, a very minimal ability that you develop. And in fact, both of them were famous for saying, I can teach you everything you need to know about remote viewing in 15 minutes. Okay? That's not strictly true. You can be taught the basics, the rudiments of remote viewing, sufficient that you could do a scientific experiment or kind of have an experience yourself. That you can do, and both of them in their seminars do that very thing. But if you want to do remote viewing operationally, which means you're actually going out and getting data that may be useful to the intelligence community or to the police or whatever, there's a lot more to the remote viewing envelope than just that basic ability.
Remote viewing is one style of doing extrasensory perception.
It distinguishes between kind of in the wild ESP or freeform ESP. It requires a certain protocol. Now, we're going to draw a distinction between protocol and method here, but it also involves methods. Now, a method, there's a lot of variety of methods of doing remote viewing, but the protocol should always be the same. Protocol involves blinding requirements. It involves, where possible, randomization. It's all the tools that science uses to avoid having a bias or adding false information into a process or into an experiment. And remote viewing at its fundamental core requires a fairly rigorous or fairly disciplined protocol in which you do it, which not all other forms of ESP require.
For example, if you mentioned tarot reading, there's a protocol for tarot reading. You need to lay the cards out. You need to understand how to interpret each card or how to interpret the pattern of the cards. So remote viewing is a different protocol. It's nothing like tarot reading, but it has rules nonetheless.
Yes, but what's confusing here is the difference between protocol and method. What you've described is actually a method, right? Because different people have different ways of interpreting the cards. And they each have their own method as to how they do tarot, right? Yeah. And in remote viewing, there are different methods like that, different recipes, if you will.
So you're making a distinction between protocol and method.
Yeah. And now to do this, I have to blame Joe McMoneagle, who was a legendary remote viewer. He and Ed May have made that distinction early on. The problem with the word protocol is it can be taken several different ways, just like the word psychic can be, right? But in a strict, I guess you could say a strict scientific framework, a protocol is the rules under which you do it. The method is the process or the recipe by which you do it. If that doesn't confuse you, I hope not.
Now, many of our viewers may not understand what blinding means in a experimental sense. So let's talk about that, because that's crucial for remote viewing.
Absolutely. So being blind means the viewer does not, in remote viewing, means the viewer has no idea what the target is. They're totally innocent of any knowledge as to what the target is. Let's say you're going to, you want the viewer to remote view the Eiffel Tower. The remote viewer cannot be informed that the target is the Eiffel Tower. And there's a number of reasons for that. We'll get into those because that's a little bit more down in the weeds. But to contrast that with tarot, you actually do know what the target is in tarot, right? Because you know who, assuming it's about a person, who the subject is that you're doing it for. They're very often sitting right there in front of you. They're very often giving you feedback as you go. And I'm not going to say this is universal, but it is very frequently the case. And that would not be true blinding, at least in a scientific sense.
There would be all sorts of opportunities for leakage, information leakage, when your client is sitting right in front of you. Yet at the same time, a tarot reader may be asked a question like, should I invest in a particular business? And you're going to need to provide information about, well, the success of that business, let's say 60 days from now, to which the reader is blind.
There is an unknown, which counts as being blind to the unknown.
Yeah.
That's true. But, and this is why you don't want the viewer to know anything about the target, is that mere fact you're talking about a business in 60 days and everything the tarot reader already knows is in his or her head that applies. And so there's a danger of speculation, of guessing, of confabulation, that kind of thing that exists there, which we're trying to eliminate in remote viewing. If a remote viewer knows what the target is, then that increases what we call mental noise, which is also another distinction from remote viewing. But increases the incidence of mental noise, which is all the racket, the guessing, the speculation, the suppositions, the bias, and everything that's going on in our minds at any given time. That goes up, and it makes it even harder to remote view to know that, okay, to know what the target is. Then all that noise ramps up. So that's one reason for the blinding. Now, there's also a feature that is blinding also includes, in this case, double blinding. And sometimes even triple blinding, but double blinding, in which anyone associated with the viewer should also be blind to the target. Now, we often have an interviewer or a monitor working with the viewer. They should not know what the target is either. There are some rules where this gets relaxed in operational settings, but we won't bother with those. Those are exceptions. So the viewer or anyone associated with the viewer before the session is completed should be totally blind to the target so that they can't accidentally, you use the term leakage, so they can't accidentally leak information to the viewer. So that's a crucial part of the protocol.
To be fair, that part of the protocol has nothing to do with psychic abilities of the viewer.
Not really. It's only to improve the noise-free nature of the process, right? And it's double blinds are used in scientific research all the time. I've heard somebody argue that, in fact, the whole double blind thing originated in parapsychology research and was adopted by mainstream science. Now, I haven't researched the basis for that, but there actually could be some truth, because there's a number of things in parapsychology research that is now in mainstream science that originated in parapsychology research. One interesting one was the electroencephalogram, EEG. That was originally adopted as a parapsychological research device. And of course, now it's used all over the world in medicine and scientific research and everywhere. So,
a very interesting story about how that came about. We've talked about it in other interviews, but let's continue now with the protocol for remote viewing and other ways in which the remote viewing protocol is different from, let's say, channeling.
We'll talk specifically about channeling, because that's a very easy difference to see, okay? Depending on what your theory is about how channeling works. If we take the basic assumption that channeling involves essentially contacting a discrete entity, usually non-physical, often dead, and getting information from that entity, you have to have the mediation of that person or thing in order for channeling to even be a thing, right? In remote viewing, you don't need the assistance of any other entity whatsoever, be it a spirit guide, be it a dead person, be it whatever. The idea of remote viewing is you are using your own consciousness, and I use this term very loosely, but projecting your own consciousness to the target. And this is all, I call it the most democratic of all psychic behaviors, because not only can everybody do it, but in fact, you're doing it yourself. You're not having to share the credit with anybody or anything else for the process. Okay, so that's one very clear distinction between channeling and remote viewing.
It sounds pretty clear, although I suppose for many channelers, their real concern is the information accurate? If I give it to the intelligence community, can they apprehend, for example, a smuggler or not? Who cares where it came from?
Well, in fact, of course, there are arguments about channeling in that it's really just a dissociative device to allow one to be psychic, and there's no other entity involved. Now, channelers will not say that because their experience is that they are encountering some entity. But some researchers say, well, it could just be a form of, well, like super psi or something, where you're using this entity to project, and it is simply it's like Dumbo's magic feather. It allows you to fly without actually finding out you can fly on your own. There's a big debate about that, and I'm not going to get into that argument further, except to say, at least from what channelers believe is happening, remote viewing is very distinct from that. In fact, let me toss in another little sidebar that actually will help. When remote viewing was developed at SRI, Targ and Puthoff and Swan and Price and all these other folks, the goal was to create a system that was independent of the metaphysics. Okay. I won't say every, because there may be exceptions I'm not familiar with, but just about every psychic behavior has a metaphysical envelope within which it is done. Sometimes it's cultural baggage from the culture where it was discovered or developed. Sometimes it's just as kind of a theoretical envelope that is based on a metaphysical premise about the universe. When I say metaphysics, I'm speaking kind of in the philosophical sense here, which means whatever's not physics, really, basically. But essentially, it's an explanation of what exists, how it exists, and how we interact with it. So a religious background, a religious story would be a metaphysical explanation. A discussion about spirits and so on, that's metaphysical. Interestingly enough, as we talked about in one of my talks with you about physicalism, the notion that the universe is just physical or the consequence of physical facts, that's the definition of physicalism, that's a metaphysical claim, because you can't prove it until you can prove what really exists in the universe, right? And so the remote viewing researchers wanted to avoid having to have any kind of a metaphysical envelope or explanation, like angels pushing the planets around or whatever, to justify or explain remote viewing. They just wanted to be the cold, hard facts. This is how you do it. This is what you do. This is the kind of results you're supposed to expect. And this is the kind of setting under which you would do it. And they don't try and figure out any kind of bigger story that could explain it in some kind of magical way sometimes.
Perhaps Angela Ford being the prime example, a woman who was part of the Fort Meade remote viewing group, but who practiced what she thought of as channeling instead of remote viewing, got lots of hits.
Well, yes, and in fact, some of the folks that work with her had that previous theory. I said that it was not really channeling, that it was just now I forgot the term I used, but essentially externalizing the causation or the source.
But she was blind to the target, I presume.
Not always. She was, in fact, on a number of occasions aware of what the target was. But she did actually, interestingly, produce some useful information on many occasions. So, yeah. So I'm not saying not being blind to the target means you're totally useless, because that's not the case. There have been plenty of cases where useful information has been developed, despite the fact that the viewer, the perceiver, we'll say, was not blind to the target. It's just it improves your chances of producing accurate data when you are.
What you're seeing with these 12 principles we're talking about is that many groups of people practicing remote viewing are going to end up experimenting and pushing some of the boundaries of these principles. And so their purpose is to let people understand what pure CRV remote viewing is really like. It doesn't mean that people should never experiment.
Exactly. Now, I do want to push back a little bit. These principles aren't intended to just represent controlled remote viewing. They're meant to be a kind of a definition, if you will, of any kind of remote viewing. This is how any kind of remote viewing should be done, CRV included, right? But yes, that's the idea, is a differentiation. It's kind of like that passage in the New Testament, know the truth and the truth shall make you free, right? Now that can be interpreted being, what the starting point is, what the basic principles are, and that means at this point, then you can start from that and start to explore and branch out and be open to new possibilities, that kind of thing. And we certainly don't want to discourage people from doing research into remote viewing and maybe tinkering with some of these principles, as long as they know what they're doing. The problem is there's so many people out there, literally thousands of people out there, who don't know what they're doing because they haven't done their homework.
Let's continue further with these principles. How else does remote viewing distinguish itself?
Well, the first thing is, well, it's not the first thing, it's one of the things, is that it's premised on this research finding that they had at SRI, that it's a very ubiquitous skill. And it means it's very widely distributed. Basically, everybody has the ability, the underlying capacity to do remote viewing once they've learned the basic process. Okay. This is in contravention to what a lot of psychics will say. They say you have to have a gift to be psychic, and if you're not born with it, then you can't do it. No matter what you do, you can't learn it. Now, I'm not saying all of them say this, but there's a large number that do. And in remote viewing, in fact, I wrote a blog article for my blog years ago that said, yes, you do need a gift to be a remote viewer. The good news is that everybody has that gift, right? And in fact, that was what the research showed, that it was just about everybody that they introduced remote viewing to and tested in their laboratory at SRI had at least some success at this. And I think that's a really, like I said, this is one of the most democratic psychic ability, right? Psychic skill. I think that's a really wonderful concept to have, to realize that we can all be enabled in this sense. It's a very, I can't think of the word, but it's a very reinforcing and very enabling kind of a thing to realize that we're doing something. When you remote view, you are doing something that society says is impossible, and yet you successfully do it. That is, I mean, it's interesting. You sit down at the end of the table where I have a student down there working on a practice session, a training session, and all of a sudden they get to the end of the thing. We give them feedback. We'll talk about feedback in a moment. They see what the target is, and they see what they've done being blind to the target, and realize this really does work. And I just did something that society says is impossible. And in fact, I knew what I knew, and I knew what I didn't know, and I put out a bunch of stuff I didn't know. This is amazing. And it's like this, they have this great epiphany, and they're thoroughly excited. That's one of the biggest rewards of teaching people how to do this.
It's amazing, and it suggests to me that the one principle, I'm going to use the word principle, behind all of this is that simply by being a sentient being, you have access to what some people would call paranormal abilities.
Yes, that's really good. It's interesting you use that word paranormal. I'm reading Jeff Kripal's latest book on impossible thinking, and he goes into some depth about that word paranormal. It was originally developed, and I forgot who he said developed it at the moment, but it was really developed to get away from all of this, the connotations of some of the more popular words to describe this kind of thing.
Supernatural.
Yes, supernatural. You've read the book, it sounds like.
And interviewed the author.
Yes, yeah. Well, Jeff's a great guy. It's interesting you share the same name. That must mean you're equally wonderful. So anyway, paranormal was originally presented as a non-tendentious term, and a term that doesn't,
Yeah, it's neutral. It doesn't imply the necessity of a deity.
Yes. And this comes around to remote viewing because paranormal has come to actually had a bunch of stuff glued to it, attached to it, that take away from its original intent. Paranormal is often now thought of as in terms of magical things or hauntings or whatever, which it was not originally meant to imply. And the same thing's kind of happened with the term remote viewing, where people will say, I do remote viewing, when they're actually doing channeling. We're picking on channeling because it's so easy to relate to here. But channeling or whatever, I do remote viewing. And when you dig into it, they really don't know what remote viewing is. Remote viewing is kind of like paranormal in that it's had all of these things now attached to it that were never meant to be attached to it. And
Well, in truth, the clear-cut distinction that we want to make between remote viewing and other psychic arts, in actual practice, it's not always so clean. I'm thinking, for example, of Lori Williams, who is a trained instructor in CRV, but recently she revealed to me that all along she's been doing spirit mediumship.
Yeah, I knew she was involved in that. And I don't have a problem with people doing both things as long as they understand the difference. I mean, I've had students who were very much into mediumship and that kind of discipline as well, and still pursue it. But I do my best to help them to recognize when you're doing one thing, you do one thing. When you're doing the other thing, you do the other thing. Now, obviously, you may cross over. People say, well, what do you use remote viewing in your everyday life? Talking to me. And I say, well, not so much. I say, I usually don't have a need for it. And that's the thing with remote viewing. It's a tool you use when you need it, right? And I usually don't have a need for it. They say, well, then what good does it do? You say, well, I mean, of course, I teach it, and a lot of people want to learn it. But in everyday life, what it has done is dramatically enhanced my intuition. Or better said, not enhance my intuition, but enhance my way of identifying intuition when it's working. And so even from I never use remote viewing, but it has helped me, from that perspective. Now, I don't say I never use remote viewing, because I still do operational remote viewing fairly regular basis. But in my day-to-day life, I don't usually use it. But that intuition, recognizing when your intuition is telling you something and then not reading into it, which will lead me to my next topic, not reading into what your intuition is trying to tell you, that's been an absolutely exquisitely valuable aspect of becoming competent in remote viewing.
Let's go into that.
Yes. So one of the other principles of remote viewing that is really kind of unique is the recognition of mental noise and tools and techniques to help you deal with that. Now, individual psychics over the centuries really probably have come to understand mental noise, and they've come up with their own little methods of dealing with it. I mentioned mental noise earlier. Let me mention it again. Our brains are set up so that they are always trying to resolve issues and give us interpretations and help us understand what the things that we are perceiving mean. Okay. And in a high bandwidth environment, which is our daily lives going around, our eyes wide open, our ears wide open, seeing things immediately. And of course, there are philosophical arguments against that. We won't get into those. And having those things, that's a high bandwidth environment where you get a lot of information and it's accurate. And our brains process that and they give us the right answers most of the time. The thing with psychic behavior in general and remote viewing in particular is we're dealing with a low bandwidth environment where the information is coming in small bits oftentimes. Sometimes you get a really great reveal, but not often, okay? You're getting bits and pieces at a time, and your brain at this point doesn't have a lot of information to work with. So it takes those little bits and it starts to conflate them. It starts to draw conclusions. It starts to jump to conclusions, and often gives you the wrong answer. So an example I use is you're at a party and you walk up to some friends and you hear the last half of the last sentence that one of them has been saying after a half-hour discussion, and you think you know what they're talking about. And so you say something absolutely stupid because you've jumped to a conclusion. Okay, our left brains, and I'll speak simplistically, our left brains are essentially evolved to do that, right? To give you a conclusion, even if you don't have enough information. And that is the root of what we call mental noise. And like I said, over the years, some psychics and some researchers have come to identify that a little bit. One of the precursors to remote viewing was René Wacolier, who wrote a book, Mind to Mind, detailing experiments that he'd done. And without going into into the minutiae on that, he did not know to call it mental noise, but he identified the basic properties and characteristics of when this happens and messes up your psychic performance. Okay,
Upton Sinclair?
Upton Sinclair. I get those two mixed up all the time. Yeah, Upton Sinclair, similar kind of experiment, similar kinds of identifications. Again, they didn't really have a good name for it. Well, in the process at our SRI, they came to a real understanding of mental noise. And this happened, of course, the beauty of it was it happened while they were in kind of the heyday of subliminal perception research, the heyday of split brain research, and a lot of the features and consequences that one found from these other two domains talked very explicitly about similar things that were happening in remote viewing. And so the Puthoff and Targ and these folks were able to go to school on what these other researchers were finding, the subliminal perception, the split brain research, and applying it to the phenomena they were observing as remote viewing unfolded in a viewer's mind. Ingo Swann came up with a name for it. He called it analytical overlay, which is where the left brain is imposing a solution that is premature, right? And that's one form of mental noise. They also coined this term mental noise that refers to some other things. Remote viewing specifically, if it's done properly, has a mechanism and approach to first to recognize the distinction between mental noise and the signal, and second, to do something about it. Now, you can't cure it. It's just a natural consequence of neurophysiology and psychology, but you can at least mediate it and help improve your signal capture by knowing how to deal with mental noise. And that's one of our 12 principles, is that's a feature of remote viewing.
How then do you distinguish between mental noise and accurate information about the target?
See, that's why people come and take my class. when people say, well, what do you teach folks when you teach them remote viewing? And I said, well, it's conceptually simple. There's three things. There's what the signal is like, and it's a very subtle, nuanced kind of an experience, the signal. What mental noise is like, and I'll give you a few examples here in a second, what mental noise is like, and then how to tell the difference and how to separate them out. So you teach them those three things. Frankly, it's easy to say that. It's really challenging to teach somebody how to do that. And my courses are focused on primarily accomplishing those three things. But as they say, the devil is in the details, and this is a very big devil here. So let me give you an example of analytical overlay. Oftentimes when people try and be psychic, they'll get these full-blown images in their mind. They're very clear, very obvious, very easily described and explained, and they're usually very wrong. Because even though it's called remote viewing in this case, but other psychics experience this as well, what you've got is usually a left brain mental construct. So Michael Gazzaniga, a now legendary researcher into left brain, he's a neurophysiologist, neuroscientist, calls it the left brain interpreter. Okay, it's like a module, speaking very loosely, a module in the left brain that gets this information and interprets it. Okay, and what it will often do is it will pick a memory or construct an image based on pieces of memory, and it'll present to you as a solution to what it thinks you are perceiving, even though it doesn't have enough information to give you an accurate result. And so if you take that image in your head, you're going to be wrong. A good example, let's say the target is the Eiffel Tower, and all you perceive in the slow bandwidth environment is crisscrossing mental girders or mental elements or whatever, metal elements, okay? And your left brain says, God, what is that? What is that? What is that? Okay, well, that reminds me of the bridge we drove over last summer when we were on vacation. Oh, that means the target's a bridge. And so instead of the Eiffel Tower, which is what it is, your left brain suggests a bridge and gives you an image of a bridge. Okay. And that's a classic example of mental noise. And remote viewing recognizes the existence of this process and offers options for dealing with it up to a certain extent.
And the options for dealing with it, as I understand it, is to try and be as descriptive as possible without interpreting.
Yes, which is actually another one of the principles. It is a very descriptive process. And that's extremely important, Jeff. Of course, I know you have a lot of background in this, not just from the people you interviewed, but way back when you even tried it yourself with Targ and Puthoff. So
I not only tried it, I used to teach it.
If you see a bridge in your head, acknowledge it. We call that objectification in controlled remote viewing. Objectify it by writing it down over to the side. But what you're doing is you're extracting it out of your process and sticking it over here, saying, well, it reminds me of a bridge. I'm not saying it's a bridge. I'm saying it reminds me of a bridge. And I'm going to go back to the descriptive part. Crisscrossing, metallic, tall, tapering, airy, and you give the description of this thing without committing yourself to what it actually is, at least until much later in the session as you go.
Okay. Now, is that true for all forms of remote viewing or just CRV?
Well, in principle, it should be true for all forms. But I think there are a lot of people who teach it out there who don't actually understand the principles, which is another reason for this document. I've known a lot of instructional teachers who don't tell their students this kind of stuff and don't really understand it themselves. And that's a problem. And I'd be perfectly happy if everybody understood it, even if they're teaching different methodology, even if they're a competitor to me. I'm interested in the best quality instruction out there, even if it's not me that's doing it. Hopefully these principles will help people start to look into these things. So when I teach a workshop, I have a workshop I call Martial Art for the Mind, which I didn't invent that term. It was borrowed from somebody, and I don't know who. Joe McMonagle claims he invented it. Lynn Buchanan, I think, has said he invented it. Other people said they invented it. Somebody did. I don't know, and I don't really care. I use it because it's a good term. Remote viewing, particularly CRV, is martial art for the mind. But when I teach that particular workshop, I don't focus on CRV. I just go for the basics, like Russell Targ or Stephen Schwartz would do, to give people at least a taste, an ability to do it at a certain fundamental level. And when I give the final instruction on how to do I call it a what's in the box experiment, where I put an object in a box. This is not totally blank because they know it's an object and they know it's smaller than a bread box, right? So I put an object in a box where they can't see me do it, tape it up, put it on the podium. I call it the magic box because I tell them it's magic because you can indeed perceive inside this box. Okay. Anyway, one of the things I teach them is just the very basics of recognizing mental noise. I explain that as a feature that has to be dealt with in remote viewing, give them the basics, and it's hard for them to kind of internalize what that means oftentimes on that short of a instructional basis. But some of them do get the idea, and they actually have some pretty decent results in many of these kind of one-off what's in the box experiments that I conduct.
And the point of the experiment is?
Well, it's to kind of teach them what remote viewing is like to a certain level, to a certain basic level. So I talk about, okay, so you don't want to just say, you think you see let me think of something. You see a robot, a toy robot inside this box. You think you see that. Don't assume that's what you're seeing. Write that off to the side. But now describe for me the colors, the textures, the smells, the tastes, the sounds that may or may not be present. And not all of those there. Sometimes there's no sounds available, but there are certainly textures and colors, qualities of light. The difference between color and quality of light is color, we all understand that. A quality of light is how light acts interacts with surfaces, substances, and colors themselves. The colors, of course, can appear differently in different kinds of light. So anyway, I explain the differences between these things. Try and describe it. Don't name it. In other words, name means add a noun to it. Don't call it a robot. Say it's gray, rounded, metallic, plastic, cool, smooth, matte, transparent, all these things that led you to think robot in your head, toy robot, when in fact it could be something entirely different that does have those properties or those qualities.
My first remote viewing experiment at SRI back in 1976 was a classic example of this. I drew a diagram, the first thing I saw, and the target, it happened to be a highway overpass over Highway 101 near Menlo Park, California. My picture was perfect. You could lay it over the photograph and see that how closely they matched. But in my mind, I jumped to the conclusion that I wasn't looking at a highway overpass with a cyclone fence around it and crisscrossing wires. I thought I was seeing a rack of clothing in Macy's department store. Complete misinterpretation of a very accurate description of the target.
I'm glad you offered that example, Jeff. That's exactly the point I'm trying to make. That's a very good illustration of it.
But I have certainly seen on many occasions what I think of as the beginner's luck effect. Totally naive people who have never done remote viewing, who have no clue that they have any psychic ability whatsoever, but they think, well, I'll give it a try. And they come to a workshop, and I have seen more than once detailed descriptions that are like 100% accurate.
It can happen. I've done that myself. Not every session I do is that good. In fact, probably the majority are not that good. In fact, I probably ought to throw in this caveat. So remote viewing is not 100%. Some of my former colleagues out there have claimed that they can remote view 100% accurately. I've yet to see evidence that they can. So,
well, not 100% of the time, but I've seen 100% accuracy on complex targets.
Yes, but not consistently, right? Not even Joe McGonigal, who's arguably one of the best. That not only, and Ingo never did it, consistently 100%.
Maybe 10% of the time, 100% accuracy.
I'd say that's a reasonable figure. Yeah. So my seat of the pants estimate is that someone who is well experienced and well trained is going to produce evidence about 2/3 of the time, about 60, 65, 70% of the time, that they have actually remote viewed and gotten information that they did not have available to themselves in advance of going out and remote viewing. That means roughly 25, 30% of the time, you're going to have failures. Okay. Now, there's obviously exceptions, and this can change from person to person, but this is a good average, right? And of the roughly 70% of the time that you show evidence that you actually did remote view, roughly half of that, or 35% of the time, it's of high quality. The results are of high quality. Okay, that's someone who's really good at this, that produces those kind of results. And of that 35%, maybe 5 to 10% are really dynamite, absolutely precise, right? So imagine somebody who's just starting out. They're not going to do nearly as well as that. And you shouldn't be discouraged. If you're trying to learn remote viewing and you're getting way more misses than you are hits, don't be discouraged. Just with practice and conscientious effort and following the principles that we've been talking about, you actually should be able to make good progress.
Are there any other principles that are really crucial that we haven't touched on?
Well, and trying to remember all 12 of them all in one batch is a little tricky, but one of the things we did that's mentioned in there is feedback. Now, these principles are actually based on the protocol that Ingo originally created, and we've already talked about a number of those things. One of those things is, well, there's two of them. One is targets have to be, in order for it to count as real remote viewing, targets have to be verifiable. That means you have to be able to find ground truth on them afterwards to check to make sure you actually remote viewed something, right? And part of that involves feedback. Targets should be feedbackable. In other words, you should be able to present the viewer with information, whether it's photos or descriptions or whatever, about the target so they can confirm what they did right and learn lessons about what they did wrong, what they got right, and also to verify the process. Now, oftentimes when you do operational, we did operational remote viewing in the military program, trying to track down the answers to intelligence questions that the various agencies that tasked us needed answers to. Those are all in principle verifiable, but weren't always verified because on too many occasions, either they never gave us feedback and we never knew precisely what the target was. We knew what we described it as, so we couldn't go out and check to see how well we did. in the military environment, oftentimes you never got feedback. And so, I don't know, how did we do? We usually gave viewers practice targets as well, so you at least did some targets that you did have feedback on. But in principle, all of those targets were verifiable.
In other words, remote viewing spirit guides or past lives or what are the aliens up to, these are things that are going to be very hard to independently verify one way or the other, are poor remote viewing targets.
Yes. Now, Ingo, in fact, said that if you couldn't verify it, it didn't count as real remote viewing. Now, obviously, and this was the topic of another one of the interviews we did together a while back, obviously, people are going to want to try and find unknowns using remote viewing because I joke when I give my talk, UFOs and remote viewing and UFOs. I joke this is kind of like using a mystery to solve an enigma, right? So they use remote viewing in the UFO environment, and I've even done that myself. I've been hired, in fact, to do that kind of thing with my small group of remote viewers. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing to do. It's only bad to do if you don't know how to do it within a protocol. And you get a lot of people who are out there, they're front loaded, they're remote viewing some event that they have no idea whether it really happened or not, and there's no feedback for it. But, it's an entertainment thing. People do it for entertainment.
Well, now you used the term front-loaded. We better define that for viewers who may not be familiar.
That means violating this blinding requirement, knowing what the target is before you even remote view. Okay, and in many cases, you get the answer that you expect if you know what the target is.
I mean, sometimes isn't it the case that viewers are given not the target per se, but a category to help narrow down what it might possibly be? They might say, well, the target is a geographic location, or the target is a person.
Yes. So that does happen. In fact, Lynn Buchanan and I think Lori probably both use that approach. It's minimal or limited front loading. And that can work. It's certainly better than saying the target is, I don't know, Beyonce or whatever.
What is Beyonce doing right now?
Yes. See, so that's really full front loading. Having a little bit of front loading in the target as a person is certainly better. It does bring some liability with it anyway, though, because, for example, if you say, well, the target is a person, and there's some prominent person in the news that you happen to be listening to that morning, then that can leak in and start skewing your data because you can't get rid of that from your head, right? People do use that. I don't, for that very reason, because I think it still, to some degree, contaminates the data, or at least can. It's problematic. And a lot of people, when they do these entertainment things like who killed JFK or the latest UFO flap or whatever, it causes problems. And so verifiable, feedbackable targets are what legitimately constitute a remote viewing target.
In other words, remote viewing is not a party game.
No, some people treat it that way. and that's fine. That's fine. As long as they know that they're doing that, which again is a reason for these principles to help them know what counts as real remote viewing, and then what you do outside of that is your own thing, right? But yes, it's not a party game. You could almost use it that way if you respect the principles. So one thing is objectification, and this has been a key part of remote viewing from the beginning. Objectification means you're actually recording your experiences as you're experiencing them. And this can be in the term of verbalizing and recording that. It can be in the framework of writing things down. Viewers are really encouraged to sketch, because sketching can oftentimes convey information that verbalizing does not. Verbalizing requires some left brain intervention, right, in order to be able to speak and write, because the left brain is the primary governor of speech and reading and so on. But sketching oftentimes it's like your right brain bypasses your left brain and puts down what it's actually experiencing without interpreting it. Your example of of the pedestrian bridge versus the, what was the clothesline, I think you said, or
a hanger of clothes in a clothing store.
Exactly. Prime example of where the sketching was 100% accurate, but the interpretation of it was incorrect, with elements of correctness, but incorrect. And so objectifying is extremely important, because what you're doing is you're taking, so the word objectify, the root is an object. You're turning this thought process, this signal line that's coming into your head, you're turning that into an object that's objective, that other people can see and observe and compare. Okay. And you put that down, they can take your sketches, they can compare the target, and know that if you did it within the proper protocol, blinding and all of that, and this sketch matches that target very accurately, it's very hard for them to deny that something psychic, something extrasensory based has happened. Okay. And so having that objective data is extremely important, but not just for the proof, right? It's also important because as the viewer goes along. So let's compare this to out-of-body experience. Now, a lot of people have had out-of-body experiences, and they describe the experience they had. One problem with out-of-body, unlike remote viewing, is that it's hard to actually go where you need to go necessarily. Oftentimes it's spontaneous, and you go wherever the out-of-body experience takes you. There are people who say that they can target themselves on specific places, but those are a small minority of the people who have out-of-body experiences. So, but even the problem there is that you have the out-of-body experience, you can't actually put down or record what your experience was until you come back. And so then you're constrained by memory. The beauty of objectifying while you're remote viewing is it allows you in real time to record what you're experiencing, and you're less likely to forget stuff that might be important.
Well, that suggests that you have to achieve a certain state of balance where you have enough of your consciousness at the target, but not so much that you can't write down or draw something that is intelligible.
That was a very clever segue to bilocation, which is another one of the principles that had slipped my mind momentarily. So I appreciate that, Jeff. That's why you're here, to keep me on track, along with many other reasons. So yes, there's this principle in remote viewing that Ingleswan also formulated called bilocation. Now, we do have this notion of bilocation from, for example, the religious literature, particularly in the Catholic world, where certain saints have been observed in two places at once, potentially even physically in two places at once. And there are other instances like that in other domains. We don't mean that kind of bilocation in remote viewing. What we're talking about is essentially having a balance of your conscious awareness or conscious experience between being in the viewing room and being actually at the target. You're sort of in two worlds at once. You have a foot in both worlds, or a bridge across them. And that allows you to perceive and experience at the target, but it also allows you to report when you're in the viewing room, and as necessary, get guidance from a monitor or an interviewer if you have someone doing that. And so it helps you to be able to objectify, to be able to bring back information in a real-time, accurate sort of a way, while yet still experiencing the target with your consciousness.
So this is crucial, because now we are talking about not so much experimental setup, but we're talking about the state of mind of the viewer.
Mm-hmm. Which obviously that's your main tool, is your mind, right? And so ultimately we can talk about all these peripheral things, like the protocol and all of that. But where the work really gets done is in the mental space. Now, whether any aspect of you actually goes to the target, as is often claimed in OBE, out of body, or whether it's just the perception of something going there, it doesn't really matter. The goal here is to produce as accurate as possible information about the target, have accurate experiences about the target, or even now accurate experiences with the target, and produce the information. And that's why it was valuable in the intelligence world, is because we were able to, not on every occasion, but on many occasions, produce data that was actually useful to the people who needed that information.
I think it's fair to say, though, that Although these principles are very important for people to understand what is and is not remote viewing, that even the father of remote viewing, Ingo Swann, engaged in projects that violated some of these protocols.
I guess, you figure you're the one that invents it, then you're at liberty to do whatever you want, right? Yeah. So, and interesting. Ingo also had an interest, for example, in astrology. He in fact, he did my chart one time, which I was pleased that he did that. He was a little, I won't say annoyed, but he was a little dubious that I happened to be a Leo. And so he, one time he actually got a little, shall we, high on wine. He had this really nice wine. We were visiting one night, and he drank too much of it, and he decided to try channeling space entities. And, it was not something he did regularly, something he just was experimenting with that evening. And even on some of his projects, he would remote view front loaded, which I was not real thrilled about, but I'm not going to tell Ingo how to do his job, right? In fact, he had me work with him and one other guy on a couple of projects remote viewing the moon. He had been requested to do that by some folks. And I think he was probably front-loaded. I was not. I was not front-loaded. And the data I produced, though, matched quite closely the data he produced. That was very reassuring to me, that both blind and not blind in his, of course, he had a huge amount of experience. I mean, he'd done literally, I would say by that time, he'd done tens of thousands of remote viewing sessions.
Well, there is the famous example where he felt he was remote viewing, you could say bilocating on the moon, and was kicked off by some alien beings who didn't want him there. I've always been puzzled about that one. Were you part of that?
I think that was when he did after I worked with him. I'm not sure. I actually have the recording of that. And that was really interesting. Now, here's the problem you run into, and I suppose Ingo might even be possible that he might fall victim to it too, is there's a lot of imagination you have to fight when you're doing remote viewing. Your mind wants to make stuff up. And were there entities there, I'll call them aliens, I guess, were there aliens there who did perceive him being there and said, "You're not welcome here, get lost"? Absolutely possible. I know there are skeptics who say, "No, that's impossible." No, sorry, it's not impossible. Skeptics don't know anything about the universe, right? But did it actually happen the way Ingo thought it did? I don't know. It was a personal, subjective experience he had. He seemed persuaded that it was happening, and so I am definitely not going to rule that out. I actually felt like I was perceived by an entity on the moon. I never had that experience before, nor do I recall having it since. And I was blind. So, I guess I should say there's probably a more than even chance it really happened, rather than it being his imagination.
But in any case, we're talking about targets that could not be verified.
Exactly. Yet. I would love to see us get some regular visits to the moon and go check some of these places out, because they are check-outable if our data is correct.
It does appear that in future decades, that will be a reality.
Yeah. It's looking promising, isn't it? As long as we can stay out of World War III.
Paul, this has been a fascinating conversation. We've covered a lot of ground. I know we haven't covered all 12 points. And I realize that as we get into the details of each of these points, it's not too hard to come up with exceptions that seem to occur even within the CRV community. So one has to appreciate that the guidelines themselves are a little bit malleable.
As is the case with most laws, rules, and systems in the world.
Well, Paul, it's been a joy to be with you again. You are always welcome on New Thinking Aloud. Anytime you come up with a creative idea or anything you would like to share with our viewers, I'm happy to have you, and I hope that we do many, many more.
Oh, me too, Jeff. You are You are a delight to work with. And I hope that you continue this project for a long time.
Well, I hope so, too. As a matter of fact, I've just turned 78, and I hope I have at least another 10 years ahead of me doing these interviews. So, Paul, thank you so much for being with me today.
You are quite welcome, Jeff. Anytime.
And for those of you watching or listening, thank you for being with us, because you are the reason that we are here.
Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
You can now download a free PDF copy of issue 7 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine, or order a beautiful printed copy.